welcome to everybody who's joining for the first time. And thank you so much for the speakers and for the guests, for the organizers, everybody for being here. This is the 8th session of Eastern Circle's Geopolitics Club, the club where we think and we discuss the past, the present, and the future of the post-Soviet region. Our current discussion series are about the power transition in the post-Soviet region. And now today we're getting finally to Russia. A lot of things to discuss about Russia, including the post-constitutional amendments situation, the difficulties with the opposition movement that they are facing after Navalny imprisonment and the general crush on the opposition, and many other issues that we're going to address today with our two speakers, Denis Volkov and Edward Lucas. But before we go there, we propose you just a little, just maybe a few minutes of trivia. Just please use the chat space to guess. What are the numbers? The numbers obviously are about Russia. What are the numbers that we are going to be showing? Please, this section is prepared by Sophie Frontil. Sophie, I give you the word.
Hello, everyone. So I will be presenting a series of numbers that have to do with Russia's political system, economic system, or certain aspects of society. Once I present the number in front of you, you will have about 10 seconds to guess what it is and write your answers in the chat box. Write whatever comes to mind and don't be shy. What is 582,000? All right, 582,000 is the estimated population decline of Russia in 2020, which is dramatically lower than it was in 2019, as you can see on the graph on the left. This is primarily due to the COVID-19 related deaths, as well as lack of incoming migration due to border closures. What is number 6? All right, number 6 is Russia's rank of total COVID-19 cases worldwide, according to the World Health Organization, with nearly 5 million cases in total. What is 13.5? 13.5, it represents 13.5 million people living in poverty in Russia today, making up about 9.2% of the total population. Poverty has decreased since the third quarter of 2020, which was around back then 17.8 million, 12.1% of the total population. What is 100,000 plus? 100,000 plus is the estimated number of Russian troop buildup at the Ukraine border last month, according to the US Department of Defense. What is 59? 59 is Putin's approval rate as of April 2021, according to the latest poll of Levada. This is relatively low rate compared to Putin's previous popularity after the Crimean annexation in particular. Putin is still, however, more popular than his prime minister, with around a 46% of approval rating, however, less than most local authorities, which share around 61% approval rating.
With that, we're going to turn to the speaker and start our discussion. Thank you very much for joining, everybody. And we're going to just maybe start with a quick introduction Today we're joined by Edward Lucas, former senior editor of The Economist for about 30 years, who spent time covering Russia, being Russia bureau chief, also has spent time in the Soviet Union, also in Russia in the 90s. He has written books about Russia, including The New Cold War, which was published for the first time in 2008, but then edited and updated after the annexation of the Crimea. He also wrote a book about the Russian intelligence services, Deception, and the book on the very kind of trendy topic today about the hybrid wars, cyberphobia. We also have Denis Volkov. Denis is the deputy director of Levada Center, a statistician and a basically career-long statistician. Can we say this, Denis?
Well, maybe not a statistician. Yeah, I'm more about
sociologist. Sociologist with statistics. Okay, thank you, Denise. Thank you, Edward. And we are going to maybe just dive into the questions. Maybe if we can stop sharing the pictures, just go directly into the faces. And we'll start with maybe you, Denise. In the Levada Center poll that you conducted in Yaroslav, that you published in January this year, you kind of take a temperature of the Russian society. And the poll refers to three groups of Russians who position themselves differently vis-a-vis the regime by their political views on politics and views on economics. Could you please describe us what these three groups are? And what is their assessment of the government and Putin personally? In particular, given the difficulties of the current crisis and the COVID crisis, who do they blame for the Russian economic problems and also for the pandemic, right? And what are their attitudes toward the constitutional amendments, especially the most prominent ones, right, out of 200 which were made concerning the prolongation of Putin's term and the, for example, the traditional values? A lot of questions in one. See if you can.
Questions. Thank you. Thank you, Anastasia. Well, I think it's you're referring to our joint project with Andrei Kolesnikov. Actually, it was not a poll, but focus groups in Moscow and Yaroslavl that we were doing last summer, I think. And we were looking on, I would say, three group of different ideologies, adherents of different ideological approaches to what should be done in Russia. Actually, loyalists, traditionalists, and liberals. We picked them up, basing our judgment on the public opinion polls with maybe main alternative views, if I may say so, and of different parts of population, and try to go deeper in their understanding what's going on, what they have in common, what they have, what differences they have. And actually, they were pretty similar, speaking on the problems that Russia is facing now. And they were mainly speaking about economic problems, that living standards are going down, and well, the government had to do something about it. Also, we saw, interestingly, that even the loyalists were very much frustrated by bureaucracy, that bureaucracy is not answering people's needs and so on. But also there were differences, mainly in the attitudes towards the authorities, and this is how we planned it. And so we try to speak about different ways of solving these problems. And what we saw, actually, I think was interesting, that that among, well, traditionalists, leftist public, there were not many big differences between them and loyalists who approve of Putin, approve of what he's doing, and their main understanding what should be done can be summarized in one sentence: more state. They wanted more state, tougher state, more regulation, more presence of state in the economy. But at the same time, even people who are, well, leftists, who support Communist Party. They still were in favor of small enterprises, small businesses. So it's kind of a petty bourgeois approach with favoring this strong state and anti-big business, anti-oligarchs, and so on. In the sense, the real alternative was in what liberal-minded people were talking: less state, less regulation. But at the same time, when we were speaking about help to the ordinary people, even liberal, those who think and define themselves as liberal-minded people. Again, I'm not speaking about activists, but ordinary public. They were still much in favor of state support to the ordinary people. So it is or other social democratic approach. So
that support, of course, was very much emphasized in the Putin's address to the Federal Assembly this year. However, if we look at the numbers, it remains quite modest, and that kind of reflects in this poll. Because if people are they feeling that there is not enough of it, that the government doesn't do enough, or are they feeling that yes, more order is needed, but however, the government is doing a good job? Because if we compare, right, what Russia did in response to the crisis with the response of, let's say, countries like France, the UK or the US, in terms of doling out money pretty much to the general population, to in terms of unemployment insurance money, in terms of help to the SMEs, there is a huge gap. It's uncomparable. And arguably, Russia had the money to dole out. Like, they have created the welfare funds, the several types of them since the early 2000s under Putin, in order for the rainy day. The rainy day funds were there. And there is an argument even within the Russian elites, right, that the rainy day funds were not distributed to the extent necessary. Do you feel that? What is the population like feeling? Is it also the perception that they have?
Well, we were looking at the attitudes of Russians towards the pandemic and the state response, and I would say that in the perception of ordinary people, the results of pandemic and the effects of pandemic were mainly economic. That people were losing their jobs, their incomes, and so on. But at the same time, people opposed the restrictions that we had, and actually the rating of Putin that you were citing at the beginning of this series, it was April of last year, actually, when his ratings were going down, first time below 60%. Now it is 65%, and actually, I think the government was very nervous and cautious, and when they introduced these strict restrictions during the first wave of pandemic, people didn't like it, and they especially didn't like when the shops and offices and maybe not restaurants, but all these small firms were stopped. And when there was very strict restrictions on movement, especially in biggest cities, and there were fines for this, and people didn't like it. And I would argue that we didn't have as strict restrictions during the second wave of COVID, exactly because government probably one, that Russia is not France, of course, in the opportunities to spend money, but also that probably the government was cautious to restrict people and to have endanger the ratings of the authorities. So it probably
And despite this restriction, despite the unhappiness, despite the falling ratings, right, of Putin personally, the majority of the population in the popular vote voted for to prolong his presidential terms pretty much indefinitely.
Yes, but we must consider the strategy that the government is using. So we, for several years for now, we have declining popularity, though I would not exaggerate it. But after the pension reform plans were introduced and against the decline in living standards, though they're happening gradually and people have some time to adjust. It's not as in the crisis of 2008, for example, when it was just even more so in 1998, when this was huge blow, a simultaneous blow. So, what the strategy is that now to secure every kind of voting, constitutional vote, the votes, the elections in September this year, the strategy is to secure that the supporters come in great numbers, and those who are critical of the government, they should stay at home. We saw it during the constitutional vote, because even prior to any voting, couple of months before the voting took place, in our polls we saw that those who were in favor, they were maybe less than 1/2 of population of the amendments, and those who were against were all about 1/3 of population. So very comparable shares of population. But in among those who were going to come, the supporters were in absolute majority. So what the government has to do now and is doing now by intimidating critics, eliminating alternative candidates like Navalny and his teams, preventing them to running the elections, they're doing exactly this. They discourage the critics to take part and influence any kind of elections. And by this, I would say that they will be able to secure the majority of United Russia, even in the circumstances of declining support to the party of power.
There is the prediction for September, pretty much. There goes the prediction for September. Edward, the question for you. The Constitution has prolonged Vladimir Putin's presidency indefinitely, but Putin is mortal, so he's not going to live forever. What are the scenario of a power transition in Russia? A palace coup, a popular revolt, or a peaceful arrangement within the elites?
Well, I think if I really knew the answer to that question, I'd probably be sitting on a yacht counting my money rather than working in a think tank. I want to actually just start off by urging a little bit of caution about terminology, because it's very easy when you, I think someone just said Russia is not France. And I think one of the things about the way Russia works is that there are all sorts of labels that seem very familiar, because we use them in other countries, but they mean something a bit different. So when we say voters and elections and constitution and results and all these other state and business and so on, it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking that this is a competitive, rule-governed political system to which these labels normally apply. And I think that's a dangerous mistake. There is clearly something happening in September, and we need to call it something, but it's not elections in the sense of the French election, where we genuinely don't know, is Macron going to get re-elected? Will people choose him over Marine Le Pen? There's a genuine uncertainty there, and the way the thing works is really quite different. And when opinion polls are taken in France, we don't have to account for the possibility that people are scared to give an honest answer. Whereas if you're phoned up in your flat by someone you're in Russia, and someone says, "What do you think of our great leader?" Well, probably the rational thing to do is to say he's great, because at least that won't get you into trouble. And one can compensate for these things to some extent, and there are elections in Russia where we have upset. So it's not like North Korea, where it's just a question of measuring the decibels with which people cheer the decision of the authorities. But I want to be really careful about getting sucked into the idea that that we can use normal political science tools to assess what's going on. There's a kind of sham competition where maybe the communists will do a bit better, or maybe some other party will do it better. But there's such a gulf between the systemic and the anti-systemic opposition that I'm very cautious about trying to read too much into who goes up and who goes down. And I think Navalny's tried very hard through his smart voting to try and add an element of meaning to these elections, but the authorities have succeeded in pushing back quite hard. So that's my little sort of prologue. But your question's a really good one, because the Russian system now and in the past, and the Soviet system in the intervening 70 years, was never very good at doing succession. One only has to look at the sort of bloody way in which the Romanovs sorted things out to see this has really got there's some deep roots here. And I think to answer it, one has to say, well, what are the roots of Putin's power? And it seems to me that Putin has two roles which are interlinked. One role is to be the arbiter of disputes within the system, and there's a lot of disputes. You have competition over financial and other resources, competition for personal advancement and demotion. There are regional tensions. So it's like a bucket of crabs all fighting. And Putin's, the job of the person in the middle is to keep the system running, so nobody wins completely, and on the whole, nobody loses completely. And the key sort of metaphor that I use here is you have to, the system stays stable so long as that everybody's relationship with Putin is more important than their relationship with anybody else. And in the communist system, there was this very important sort of taboo about horizontal organization. So what the communist system very much didn't want was that the first secretary and, I don't know, Stavropol would get together with the first secretary in some other place and start building a kind of clique. It was very important that the decision-making goes upwards and not sideways. And I think there still is a bit of that Putin has this role as the absolute sort of arbiter in the center, and making sure that you never get a coalition of forces that is so strong they might start thinking, why do we need Putin? We're so strong. So that's the first element. And the second element is that, sorry?
I'm just going to catch you on that thought that you were saying that Putin is in the center, then you think, of the system, and then he's kind of very attentive not to have coalitions built around him. Well, what do you think then about this other hypothesis, that there is a collective Kremlin, so to say, that Putin is just a front in front?
Well, that's my second point, really, is that Putin fulfills this function, but not just by force of personality. He does it because he has backing among the people who put him in power. So he's got some sort of deep institutional and personal backing. These people we've all these old friends, whether it's a sort of Azorro cooperative or others. But he's also got this personal popularity. And this is very important because this is what makes the whole system function. Russians will put up with the poor performance of the public sector, international isolation, and so on, if there's someone there to present the narrative, to say this all matters because. And Putin's personal credibility and personal popularity gets that across. And so he says we're surrounded by enemies, so we have to spend a lot on defense. We have, the bad people trying to muck the system up. We have to crack down on them, and you see this, for example, in these extraordinary lengthy annual phone-ins that he does. That he's channeling political energy from the public into the system, and he gives it, and he gives it a sort of legitimacy and a credibility. But these two things are interlinked, because if his popularity goes down, then his ability to function as the arbiter becomes much less. And so I think the system, in a sense, is quite unstable. It's unstable from his popularity dropping. It's also unstable because what would happen if a coalition built which was sufficiently strong to challenge his role at the centre? So that isn't, I haven't really answered your question, because I genuinely don't know the answer.
That's it right away. So your bet then, if I understand correctly, is that it's going to be a palace coup, because never once you mention the possibility of a revolution, of any.
Well, I wouldn't be sure about that. I mean, I think, I mean, there's different sorts of palace coup. You can argue there was a palace coup against Yeltsin.
Palace transition, if you want, because just in case he dies.
Well, I mean, clearly he's. Yeah, he's not. I mean, he's not going to stay there until he's 150. So there will be. He will leave power in some way, and it's an open question to me what those circumstances are. Maybe he finds a way in which he can leave power safely, and that's what he offered Yeltsin. And maybe there is a Putin, and a sort of neo-Putin out there, who will offer him the immunity from prosecution and dignified retirement that he and his lot were able to offer Yeltsin. That's a possibility. He's on the record, of saying to someone, "How can I leave? Who would I trust to protect me if I retired? Dima?" By which he means Medvedev, and he said that, I think, to a visiting Finnish president or someone. So there's a kind of, it's clearly it's a preoccupation. It might be that he's presented with an offer he can't refuse. You go to become head of the Judo Federation or speaker of the Federation Council or something, but you have to go. And if you don't go, it's going to get messy. So I mean, that will be negotiated, where he will have somewhere between 1% and 99% of the political power in the way it's negotiated, but we don't know at this stage how it will be. And also it's possible he just dies in office. I mean, he might die naturally, he might die from being poisoned. And I think it's most likely that there comes a point at which he goes, and but whether that's at the means and time of his own choosing, or because the political, as we used to say in the Soviet days, the correlation of forces is against him, that remains to be seen.
That remains to be seen. Thank you, Edward. Denise, how do Russians understand freedom? I mean, you've done some work on that.
Well, Russians, and I think as many people, are not very good at the abstract meanings. And it's very hard to speak about this abstract meanings in focus groups, for example. We try to do so about freedom, democracy, and so on and so forth. I would say that the questions when we discuss this issue should be very specific.
I was going to get a bit more specific. I was actually thinking about your work when you did that, like either in focus groups or via polls, just asking basically about different types of, about what the freedom was, and then people defined it in a certain way. It was totally different. Also, reactions and what freedom actually means and how they perceive political freedom. But I can get more specific. Since Putin came to power in the year 2000, right, and became president, he kind of established a sort of a social contract with the Russian society, where he offered stability, mainly meaning economic stability, which happened to be also the power stability. He's the only man in power, but we're really talking about economic stability in exchange for political freedom. That was offered to the oligarchs, right? You can keep your field of operation if you do not touch the social field. That was offered to the population, right? Keep voting for us, your economic situation is going to get better. And indeed, between 2000 and 2008 especially, it has been clearly improving. After 2008, the results are much more mixed, right? But based on the price of oil and a steady increase. And then in exchange for political freedom, which of course was sliced, away from the population, stage by stage, from from taking away the direct elections of the governors of the regions to reshuffling, to increasing the years of power of the Duma, of each term of the president, to pretty much just basically managing the power transition, right? And yet the balance has dwindled since 2008. Really, we see that economically, the situation is more and more difficult in many regions across Russia, that the poverty rates that statistically that we've highlighted in the beginning, they barely reflect the reality on the ground. There are many places where poverty, although it's not defined as by the international organizations living on below $1 a day. However, it's really flagrant if you go and travel and you see what happens on the ground. And after 2011, we've seen that Russian economic growth has turned into stagnation pretty much. And then after 2013 already, even before the events in Ukraine, we've seen the decline, which just continued in 2014, in fact. And of course, after the intervention in Ukraine, the collapse of the oil prices, right, that followed that in June 2014, then in the introduction of sanctions against Russia in July, that of course increased, still increased further that pressure, right? And as the political and economic stability kind of turned into stagnation and pretty much decline, then why have the Russians been still accepting of that diminishing amount of freedom, which now is pretty much very physical, right? You go demonstrate, you go out to protest against pretty much anything, and you are assured either to be beaten on the spot or people are going to come and see you afterwards at your place of work, at your place of residence. So more and more freedom is being taken away, and more directly, yet the other side of the bargain is less and less fulfilled. Why is that? In exchange for what do Russians trade the freedom, the political freedom?
Well, first of all, I would say that in our polls, we see in discussing then in focus groups that not everyone will agree that there is less freedom now, but because they have, they are comparing it with the Soviet times. And they say, look, there's more freedom to go somewhere, to buy what you want, to have what you want, to travel, to read and watch films. So there's kind of a consumer freedom and also freedom of movement, for sure. But of course, part of society who is more active, this is under threat and under pressure. Those who try to go beyond their daily routine, and here again the process was not straightforward of this declining living standards, because again this Crimea's annexation and how it was perceived, it intervened very much, because people for what the effect of this was that the attitudes towards the authorities increased very much, because of many people felt that Putin made the world maybe not exactly love Russia, respect Russia, but at least count, to keep Russia in mind. And for many people, it was better when the whole world just neglect Russia. So these brought the ratings very, very high. And the crisis that came very soon after the events, actually the same year, the government, the authorities came so to speak prepared for this with high approval ratings. And so we saw that they were sliding gradually, begin to slide already in 2014 and 15, but from the very high point. And by 2018, especially after a pension reform was introduced, and this effect of Crimea was gone by 2018, we actually saw that dissent reappeared, because for several years there was no such dissent, and we saw even before any protests of Navalny and his team protest in different Russian regions where people by default already were not happy with the authorities and were trying to press them on the issues that matter for the people. And we had a number of such stories in recent years. But also,
maybe we can touch upon that. So in terms of the opposition movement, we've seen the opposition, people protesting more and more. Like we've seen on a variety of issues, right, from environmental protests to protests against garbage dumps, to protests against Orthodox churches being built in public parks, to protests which are more larger issues addressing anti-corruption, anti-police violence, for the right to run in municipal council elections, and then for the liberation of political prisoners, be it the former governor of Khabarovsk or Alexei Navalny himself. Could you just shed light for us on the profile of this protester? Who is protesting, who's taking this active position, which is very risky and increasingly so, and who just stays basically away from the active protest, either on social media or physically going on the street, just not to have those kind of annoyances afterwards with the police? And how has this demographic evolved over the 10 years? For example, there is this, what it looks to, there is this kind of propaganda or maybe just communication disseminated by somebody that Navalny, for example, is only supported by the youth. Well, when we look at the people who go out on the street, we clearly see that these are not, majority of them are not just super young people. So who are these protesters? How do you see them? How do you classify them, if you can?
Well, all these protests are very different, and they have quite often different audiences. Very much depend whether the government allowed people to go. Well, because in Russia we have to get this permission to vote. And if the organizers have it, then quite often it's very mixed public with older generation showing up. And for example, the big protest in Moscow in, I think, 2017 against this refurbishment scheme.
There was a lot of youth,
a lot of grown up, a lot of, well, senior citizens who showed up and actually had their way. And after the government had to introduce new guarantees into this scheme. But I think what they have in common, these protests, that they are anti-bureaucratic. But many of these protests as well, they are not anti-Putin, because the protesters quite often they want to highlight their loyalty to the authorities, to Putin, and not to suffer repressions. They understand very much that if you challenge the federal authorities, you will be very much suppressed. But it doesn't change very much the origin of this protest, that people want held government and I would say authorities, local authorities accountable, and quite often they manage to do so, but not so when it is directly political protest. And we see how right now the Navalny and his supporters are out across the country. They are under, well, big pressure, political, even, well, Navalny is in prison. Many of his supporters face charges and can go to prison. And exactly, it is happening exactly because this network was important in organizing simultaneously the protest across the country, making it, well, national protest, because quite often
not just big city capital. Yes, Yeah, and that just a question about Navalny. So very good that you got to that point. It's just what do people think about him? Because we see that on the one hand we have all the pro-Navalny coverage in the West. We see the picture of massive protests in support of Navalny across the country, as you mentioned, in big cities, but which are very far from Moscow, and in smaller cities as well. And however, we know also that it's not as clear cut. It's, if we can compare, I don't know if it's comparable scale, but we can compare almost to Gorbachev in the sense that the personality is perceived in the West versus at home. That it's not as clear cut, the perception of an average Russian, if we can use that expression, or the overall public of Navalny is not as clear cut as we see by looking at the tens of thousands of people going on protesting. It's not literally every Russian. How is he perceived in Russia before and after his imprisonment? And then what are the people who are protesting? So you mentioned, of course, the people who are actively supporting Navalny and who work in his team, so to say. And there's a lot of people across different regions, but also the people who basically that follow, who respond to that call. Do they protest all for Navalny, or do they protest against something else?
Well, first of all, we in our polls we saw how he was gradually building his authority. He started actually by in politics he was pretty early, but when he was establishing his anti-corruption foundation in 2011, I think, and now which is recognized by Russian government as how is it?
A foreign agent.
Not a foreign agent, but an extremist organization.
Extremist organization,
Yeah.
even better.
Even
higher
yeah. But with establishing it, he got first recognition that was he was surfacing in our open-ended question for the first time. And from there, we saw how he was building his authority as a leader of the protests of 11 and 12, then a leader of Russian opposition, anti-corruption fighter. And by last year, according to our polls, he was approved by 20% of population, which is
for Russia, for the opposition leader of any type at this point.
Yes, and he's so 20%. Mostly young generation, not children, as quite often Russian state media try to present them. It's 25, 35 years of age, and they were the majority of his protests in the beginning of this year. But not only them. But why so? Because he was able only to work through social networks. And he was one of the first politicians who successfully launched his YouTube account. And he was first, not even politician, but one of the first popular video bloggers in Russia, but only with the creation of mass audience of YouTube, which happened in Russia 2 or 3 years ago. He was able to go to the larger scale because still older generation watch TV and dependent on the state media. And here in the social networks, now we have a small renaissance of independent media with establishment, not only Navalny, but video bloggers like Yuri Dudь, like Pivovarov in Redakция, Еще не поздно and others. So, and because of this exactly, we see that younger generations, they are more critical towards the authorities. They have different opinions, and actually not only authorities, but also the older generations are very anxious about it, that younger generation is different. And as well as Russian authorities, older generations quite often want to suppress it and to re-educate, rehabilitate them into their own discourse. So it's the social basis of reaction that we are facing in Russia right now. That's
Thank you. Thank you so much, Denise. Edward, to pick up on that last point by Denise, that there is an emerging number of younger video bloggers with an increasing kind of reach and audiences in Russia itself. Could we say, thinking about the future of the opposition, what it can imply then? Let's say with Navalny in prison, his organization entirely busted by the government. Literally, physically, people are visited, right, at their home, at their workplace. Now, can we say that what was most important, what's been most important so far, even beyond the mass reach, right, to over 120 million, if not more at this point? I don't know, Denise have watched his latest video about the Putin Palace, right? So, but beyond that, has he launched a trend? Can we say, like, viewed from the West and by the observer, which is not just sitting inside Russia, but has he launched a trend in which the opposition just breaks free, basically? It doesn't depend on the street anymore, it doesn't depend on the physical presence, and it doesn't even depend on one person, a party, definitely no longer party, because he was very early on, he was disabled from having a party, but it can just go entirely, it can find new and new ways of getting out of control of the government.
Well, I would love to say yes, but I think the evidence is against it. I think there's my feeling is that the opposition is pretty severely constrained, but the regime has the guns and the money, and for now it's got the sort of political center of gravity is on its side, and they are happy to allow a measure of opposition activity on the sidelines of politics, but they're not willing to allow it to get close to power. I think one can see a potential sort of path for the opposition where you get regional protests, Khabarovsk, but many more places like that, the middle classes in the big cities, and blue collar workers, maybe truckers or some other group that's sort of well distributed and used to thinking for itself, and that could be a coalition. But I think the Kremlin isn't stupid, and they're not going to let that continue. And it was tremendously exciting seeing the Khabarovsk protests and watching them waving Belarusian flags there as well. I thought, golly, if I was Putin, I'd be worried about that. But it fizzled out in the end, and it's really hard to get the sort of critical mass in a big country like Russia. The center is better coordinated and has more repressive means than the opposition has inspirational ones. So I think really for the opposition to succeed, the regime has to fail. And it has to fail either with a serious economic setback where people get really fed up with falling living standards, and I don't see that happening really, or a really serious foreign policy setback which humiliates Russia, like a badly failed war. And I don't think they're stupid enough to do that. So I don't quite see where the failure comes from.
Thank you. Then just to rebound on your mentioning of Belarus, Edward, what are the lessons that you see the Russian state having learned from both the smart vote, right, that strategy used by Navalny to just rally people to vote based on the most having chances to win party, whether from systemic opposition like the communists or non-systemic opposition, and just in order to beat pretty much united Russia, and that worked for some time, and then the government found a way to go around it. Then what are the lessons that the state has learned from the mass protests, right, in Belarus? That was a great learning ground for Russia, in Khabarovsk itself, and how do you anticipate these lessons to be applied in September elections?
Well, I think the lesson from Belarus is pretty grim, really, which is that targeted, even in Belarus, which is more, Lukashenko is worse than Putin. He's ridiculous in a way that Putin isn't. Belarus has got more to gain. There's a clearer path to what a post-Lukashenko Belarus would be like. The opposition starts with some advantages, including very friendly neighbors. And even there, the regime has stayed in power without too much trouble. They've fought a war of attrition, which they've won. The opposition didn't succeed in, and regimes tend to either to split at the top or crumble at the bottom. And this regime didn't split at the top. Lukashenko, there were no serious defectors, and the opposition didn't really manage to get the industrial workers, who were the backbone of the regime's strength, to support them, and they didn't manage to get any defections from the sort of ranks of the police and the security services. The authorities were able to deploy surveillance technology quite effectively. They use mobile phone. We used to think that mobile phones and electronic communications were a great gift for activists because they were, like samizdat printing presses and typewriters, only way better. We now realize they're a terrible trap, and that the Chinese style surveillance technology means that the authorities can work out exactly who's talking to who, if not always exactly what they're talking about. They can track us wherever we go. They can spot people, who are the people in this crowd who don't have their mobile phones with them. Well, that's suspicious. Find them on CCTV, run that through the database. We now know who they are. We can work out where they live. So there's a sort of Orwellian side to this, which is really, really quite worrying. And so I think that in a way, one could almost say that Belarus is a sort of road test for the regime, for the repression it may need to use in Russia. And I'm pessimistic about this. And I think it also underlines a point that we're still in amateur hour here. I remember what as I mentioned at the very beginning, I was around in the 80s, and I remember what Solidarity was like in Poland in the sort of 80, 81 period. And there was a smell of power and seriousness, and, to use military terminology, mass and readiness about Solidarity, which is just missing in Russia, and it's missing in Belarus. We don't have the leadership. I don't see the Jacek Korons, the Wałęsas, the Michniks. It's a thin bench, to use American football terminology, and depresses me. I know what successful revolutions look like, and this doesn't look like one.
Thank you, Edward. Denise, back to you. Already, if you have any response to this, to what Edward is saying, and then a question about Levada Center in particular, because one of the tools, so to say, to address, to repress any expression is, of course, to introduce those different labels which allow to marginalize them, organizations and any expression, so to say, organized expression. And one of the labels is foreign agent, another is extremist organization, as you mentioned. And Levada Center has been awarded with that foreign agent label recently. How do you cope with this label, and how do you manage to stay one of the leading social analysis and statistics center in Russia and the post-Soviet region? What are your strategies, and how do you see your future? As well as the future of the Russian opposition, just to address again Edward's assessment, which is rather grim.
Well, it's very hard to make any forecasts in this. Surely this label was put on us to marginalize the organization. And of course, I mean, but again, you should understand that the process of putting civil society under control by Russian government was began not with foreign agent law, much earlier. So it was the logical continuation of this process. And the problem is not even these new bureaucratic functions that we have to, bureaucratic norms that we have to follow, but also that you never know what will happen next week, whether we can be fined for something, and so on and so forth. So we are a big organization, but many organizations who were put on this list were just closed because they had no money for paying the fines, which are
the way the sponsors and the fines become just totally
very, very big, especially for small organizations. And well, and I think well, our stretch is and was that well, we try to uh, earn our own money for doing sociological research, and of course it's harder to do now than before, but it's very always quite often a gradual process when the government try to just make life harder and harder for such organizations. Not always it is in one blow. It's with the Navalny organization, for example, we see that it's one just decision to put you on the list of extremist organization. You just can't function. Or for organizations from the West, which are put on the list of undesirable organizations, then again, you can't operate in Russia and can't the work is done, and you can't these organizations can't function here. So it is well, a very prolonged process, and the only way you can cope with, just try to be determined to do your work, and so go on with it. And with sociological research, I think the problem is it is not. So I think that the sociology ends when the people are not easy with answering questions of sociologists, because more or less it reflects how they behave themselves in the public sphere. The problem.
I see that's a reaction that Edward would like to respond to that, maybe to that first piece about the.
Well, let Dennis finish first, but I want to come in when he's finished.
Yeah, well, it's only several seconds. The problem is when there is no ability to ask these questions. And we are very near, I would say, to this, because already many organizations, sociological organizations, are not ready to ask questions on political issues.
Auto-censorship. The big result is auto-censorship.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I mean, I think that what the Kremlin has done is it says you can play the game as you want, but we write the rules. And so you think you're playing football, and you are in a sense, but one side's goal is very big and the other side is very small, and one team is full of very strong people and the other team have their legs tied together, and so you can say it's football, but it's not really. But I want to say something that I think this external dimension is super important, because we in the West have a major role here, and we've got things seriously wrong, and I'm quite cross about it. But I think that when I saw Navalny in London a few years ago, when we were talking about this, and he said, people say I'm anti-Western, and I am anti-Western because it's in the West that all this money is laundered. There's a symbiotic relationship between the Western financial system and Russian kleptocracy. And I think we focus quite rightly and also harshly on the corruption and brutality inside Russia. But we don't look at ourselves and say, well, why is it that we sustain these people? It's in the West that they put their money. It's Western bankers and lawyers and accountants who help them count the money and invest it and make it all look legal. And we love getting on our high horse and saying, oh, this is terrible, but we're part of it. And I really commend, if anyone hasn't read it, Oliver Bullow's book, Moneyland, and also his weekly Oligarchy newsletter. I'm giving testimony to Congress next week on this, about to the Foreign Affairs Committee in Congress, about the sort of the politics of Russian kleptocracy. And we have to be, we could make this not impossible, but really difficult if we wanted to. And we don't. and it's very easy for us to say, let's give money to Russian Democrats. And so we send some taxpayers' money to go and pay for sort of photocopiers and computers and training and stuff like that. And this is a kind of Medvedskiy uslugi. It's a kiss of death, because then they get into trouble under foreign agent laws and possibly go to prison and have terrible problems. And we feel very virtuous because we've given a few million to Russian Democrats. What we should be feeling is guilty because we've laundered a few billion from Russian kleptocrats. And I think that is perhaps the starting point for any discussion of Russian democracy, is who funds enables the anti-democrats. And I'm afraid the answer to that in large measure is us.
Thank you so much. These are excellent points. And maybe we're going to turn a little bit with that toward the role of the West in continuing Russia, or the Russian foreign policy, so to say, in interaction with the West in the foreign policy field. And there's a follow-up to what you say, and or just a question to you again. After a few weeks of military buildup of the Russian troops along the border with Ukraine, right, that we've seen in April, we witnessed a strong verbal reaction of Western leaders. That we witnessed, certain Western leaders, not all. We also saw Vladimir Zelensky going on a tour, ending up eventually starting from Paris and ending eventually in Istanbul as well, just not really limiting himself to Europe. And then eventually we had a call by Biden, to the new president of the US, Joe Biden, to President Putin, and all of a sudden the soldiers returned to their barracks. What was it? Who was it for? And what were the main goals? And why did it end so suddenly?
There's a scene in a film, and I've forgotten what the film is. It's about two guys who go to the gym, and they're doing press-ups and bench presses and all this sort of stuff. And one of the guys is there to keep fit, and the other guy is keeping count. And at the end, the guy who's keeping count says, "I won," and the other guy goes, "Did you? What?" And I think that there's different games going on here, and so in a way, both sides have got what they wanted. Ukraine showed it wasn't intimidated. It got international attention. I think Zelensky handled it pretty well. He didn't have to back down on anything significant. Indeed, he's pushed ahead with the Medvedchuk prosecution. And so I think if you look at it through a Ukrainian lens, you can say, well, yeah, we actually did all right. We weren't forced into restoring the water supply to Crimea. We didn't have military defeat. We weren't diplomatically isolated. We didn't look stupid. So, that was quite good for us, and therefore must be bad for Russia. But unfortunately, Russia wasn't looking at it from that point of view. I don't think Russia went into this saying we are going to get a sort of major geopolitical victory and make Ukraine look stupid. They were doing it for other reasons. And they also got what they wanted. They, first of all, from a military point of view, this was a good exercise. Every time Russia does this, they get a bit better. They move large numbers of troops and equipment over long distances at short notice, which is something the West can't do. When we want to move troops across Europe, we start planning 6 months in advance. They can give an order and it happens in 6 days. So for the defense of the Baltics, these exercises are really ominous because they show this speed of assembly, which we lack, and Russia gets better just by practicing that. It looks good domestically, because people like seeing this. The idea of we're standing up to, because of the demonization of Ukraine in the Russian media. You can then say these wicked people didn't do the terrible thing that we said they were going to do, so that means we won. Now, they're not wicked people, and they weren't actually going to do the thing they said they're going to do, but who cares? So inside the Russian propaganda bubble, this is easily portrayed as good. And thirdly, they haven't gone away. This concentration's still there. And I think that what probably, I'm only guessing here, and as I said, if I knew, I would be rich and not here. But I think that there's a war of nerves going on, and one of the things they did was to get us to cry wolf. I guess most cultures have this story of the little boy who says there's a wolf coming, and it isn't a wolf, and he says it often enough until nobody believes him, and then the wolf does come, and it's too late. And there were far too many people, I get really cross about this, there were far too many people who just joined the dots and said, Russia is about to launch a military attack on Ukraine, and panic. The house is on fire. We need American warships in the Black Sea. We need lethal weapons. We need this. We need that. And it was obvious to me and to people who were watching from a sort of proper military point of view, this could be the prelude to a military attack, but it is not the military attack because it doesn't fit. There's not enough secrecy. The radio traffic wasn't right. There weren't the hybrid measures that you would expect. This was a show of force, but it was not a prelude to attack. But enough people cried wolf, including in Ukraine, that next time they do this, those warnings will be believed a bit less. And so I think that was also quite an important game. So that's my answer. One side was doing press ups, and the other side was counting press ups. And so they both got what they wanted. But I remain really worried about this. And I would say one final thing, which is that summer's coming and Crimea doesn't have any water. And this is a serious problem. Putin needs success stories, and Crimea is not a success story if people are queuing for water. He can't bring water in by tanker. He can't bring it in across the bridge. The only place the water can really come from is from that canal. And so I don't think, so I think he will come back and try again and see if he can negotiate. That would be a good outcome for him, water in Crimea. And he may give something, he may threaten something, but that I think is an important Russian endgame.
Thank you, Edward. Just maybe before coming back a little bit to the region, to the Black Sea region, let's say, Denise, a question for you. It's often argued that the Russian foreign policy is a cover-up for domestic problems, from the Second Chechen War to the 8-day war with Georgia to the Crimea annexation. Every single operation is followed by a slight jump or a jump in Putin's approval ratings. This has proven to be, over the years, very reliable. And now, over a short time, as you noted, then it fades out. The effect fades out with just a couple of years, but every time it works. How popular is Vladimir Putin's warmongering today, when pretty much, as the Russians often have this comparison, an empty fridge is trying to outcry a loud TV set?
Well, I would have, I'm not quite sure if I putting it right. I mean, I would love to say that he will, there will be no this build-up of support for Putin this time if anything happens. But I would say that even in 2013-14, before the conflict, there was nothing in public opinion showed that it will be a popular conflict, because the overall attitude was you should not give any money to Ukraine, you should not send troops to Ukraine, you should not help Ukraine in any way because it's different country. But then the topic of Russians under the threat was introduced, and a lot of effort was put into convincing people that Russia should intervene. And by this, I think this topic of Russian-speaking population under threat, this actually worked. But after huge effort that was put in state propaganda, so on and so forth. So it all depends on what discourse will be used, how it will be portrayed, and how it will look like inside the country, and what topics will be used to justify the conflict if it happens. But for sure, this time the Russian public opinion is more inward-looking than before. and more concentrated on social issues, but it always is concentrated on social issues. So it all depends on the context. And in Syria, for example, war in Syria was not popular and is not popular, and the strategy is very different here. The strategy is to minimize any information from Syria, and actually partly doing so by deploying this not regular troops there. And if there are not regular troops, well, the majority say, well, they choose to go there. Why should we care?
Well, the same strategy was applied in the east of Ukraine.
Yeah, at least in Syria there
That was the narrative.
formal.
The volunteers went on vacation.
Yeah, try to limit the information and not to bother public opinion by all these troubles. So it could do.
I think that there's an element of theatre in this. There's this new, very trendy English word, performative, which means doing it to show off. And I feel that both domestic politics has this sort of performative element, but also foreign policy, that the aim is to show, as Dennis said at the beginning, that Russia mustn't be ignored. It was the most hurtful thing. I think it was Condoleezza Rice said, forgive Germany, punish France, ignore Russia. And that really hurt. You know, Russians of any political persuasion will say, we are one of the great civilizations of the world. We're the largest country by landmass. We have, you can disagree with us, it's fine, but don't ignore us. And I think a lot of the of the Putin regime's foreign policy is this sort of craving for attention. And even if the attention is negative, it's still better than not having attention at all. And I think that's one of the things about these so-called frozen conflicts, and I hate the phrase frozen conflict, is they keep Russia in the game. Russia's part of Russia plays a role in the Caucasus. Russia plays a role in Moldova and the Black Sea, Ukraine. Thanks to the Syria involvement, it's back at the table in the Middle East. It's there in the Arctic, and this is important. And just those sort of clips on telly of Lavrov meeting Blinken are important. And there's a theory, and I won't assess it at this stage because I think that you can argue both sides. But if you really wanted to hurt Putin, perhaps the thing to do would be to completely ignore him, put him totally in the diplomatic deep freeze. And it was quite interesting that at the May the 9th parade, the only foreign leader to turn up for the Victory Day parade was from brotherly Tajikistan, which is perhaps not the greatest lineup. There's a counter argument to that, which is that if you ignore Russia, then they behave even worse the regime behaves even worse in order to attract attention. So I can see both sides. And this is, of course, absolutely no comfort for Ukraine, because Ukrainians, many thousands of Ukrainians have been killed and tens of thousands made homeless, and it's fighting continues with terrible casualties all the time. So it's no comfort to you to be told that you're basically a stage prop for a theatrical performance being put on by the Russians without your consent. But I do think there's a large element of truth in that analysis.
A question about this is a very good point, especially about the fact that ignoring what is an alternative, and an alternative treatment that can have an impact is ignoring, not an alternative treatment which actually can have an impact. A question about the communication about the pivot to Asia, maybe Edward. Since before 2014 already, Russia has often mentioned that if there is any problem with Europe, with the US, well, Russia can pivot to Asia. It can therefore create this sort of a rapprochement with China to counter the US, especially. That's how Russia presents it. What signal does it send to the West, and how well is it perceived? What is the real cost-benefit analysis of this strategic partnership? And how effective has this communication been?
I think we really need an entire seminar on this, and I have just written a sort of, not quite a book, but a very long study on this called Partnership Without Substance, which is looking at Russia and China and their cooperation and friction. I think there's a few sort of very brief points. One is this is a very asymmetrical relationship. China's big and on the way up. Russia is a great deal smaller and stagnant or on the way down. And China doesn't take Russia terribly seriously. There's for what really matters for China is, number one, the relationship with the United States, and number two, its relationship with the big rich countries of the West, and everything else is sort of basically for show. So China would sacrifice its toeholds in Serbia and Belarus and so on overnight if it thought it would getting something that it minded about in Bavaria or somewhere like that. So there's a kind of very power politics is important here. I think Russia likes to sort of scare the West by saying, if you don't, I've got options. In a way, it's a bit like Lukashenko does towards Russia. He says, I've got options. And well, yes, you have in a way, but the options actually, to be realistic, things would have to be very different. And does Russia really want to play the role as a sort of seriously junior partner to China? I don't think so. I'm not even sure the Chinese would want that. What you do have is very specific cooperation. So there's cooperation on avoiding sanctions, and particularly avoiding the use of the US dollar. And we will see, and I can see an alternative world payment system taking shape, whether it's based on a kind of Russian-Chinese cryptocurrency or something else remains to be seen. But there's lots of people, the Iranians, Venezuelans, lots of people who would like to have a way of settling their bills that was out of reach of the United States financial authorities. So that's the thing that's happening. There's the lunar space station that, they're both space powers, and Russia's got a bit of an edge in space compared to the Chinese, but there's room for cooperation. And then there's the nuclear deal, which was just inked this week, and China's interested in Russian nuclear power. So that's a thing. We're going to see Chinese participation in the Zapad exercises, again, just signaling to the West that there is Russia is not isolated. And there's, I think, the Chinese surveillance technology is of serious interest to autocrats in Russia and elsewhere. This ability to put together the mobile phone data and the CCTV and work out who's who, what's what, where they're going, what they're saying, is a major. I mean, when Russia looks at Xinjiang, they think, "Gosh, wouldn't that be nice?"
There's definitely experience exchange that can be useful for both sides, but then of course the question of
but the idea that there's a sort of big strategic partnership, this is a nothing burger. It's great if you want to write a geopolitical thriller. It's fine for a plot. If you're playing a geopolitical board game, yes, sure, of course, Russia and China will get together to screw the West. But it's much more complicated than that, and the substance is lacking, and it's going to continue to be lacking.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Maybe we'll turn to the audience for a few questions. If anybody wants to jump in, just jump in directly. We can take maybe 3 questions.
If I may jump in.
Go ahead.
Thank you, first of all, for this interesting discussion. I had a question. Do you think that really these technologies would have a place? Because, I mean, they are an equivalent of what Western society is using, like in a Facebook, like every social media information is shared, basically. So it is rather like a different kind of a technology, but pretty much the same. But we can see that this does not work. Like if we will look at the politics situations in America, so basically the coverage of like what people share, what they talk, they are quite awkward. Like if you would look at how politics are working in Russia, like how they block some Twitter accounts, how they try to sue people for their comments and so on and so after. They are pretty like scary, but they are not quite like effective in a long time. Don't you think so?
No.
That's a short answer.
I mean, this is a huge discussion, but I think that there's a fundamental difference between the rapacious and disgraceful behavior of Facebook and the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party, because Facebook, you don't have to be on Facebook. You can, I mean, I don't use it. You can use all sorts of privacy tools to keep your profile a bit lower. And these things aren't integrated. You know, if the we had this in Britain with the Salisbury poisoning, that when the authorities wanted to, they were able to put together CCTV from the airport, from the railway station in Salisbury, and from the mobile phone data. And eventually they were able to identify the two Russian tourists who were so keen to see the spire of Salisbury Cathedral and accidentally used nerve agent on one of their several trips there. But yeah, this was a major, it was a major operation for Britain. It involved a whole range of different legal and unusual legal powers and cooperation. And in the end, we did it. But it doesn't happen on a routine basis. And in China, that's not an exceptional. That's how China works, particularly in Xinjiang. It's not how everywhere in China works. So I think there's we can, if we want to, we can vote for politicians who will break up Facebook and who will do different. We can run things differently, and I wish we would, but the fact we don't doesn't mean we can't. And in China, you don't have that opportunity.
There is another question about the also public opinion and secret polls. So maybe also for Denise as well as for Edward, is that there is this rumor running around that the Russian government is not just relying on official polls, but also uses secret polls, therefore that kind of help it direct its actions. What do you know about that? Is that true?
Well, there was a publication in Medusa maybe a year ago about this secret polls, but well, every poll that is secret, the poll that we don't know the methodology of, well, it's worse than the regular poll. So, and the authorities is using conventional polls, if I may say so. So different tools, and probably this FSO polling, probably they are all right, but as we don't know the methodology, can't say anything. But they are doing them, yes, sure.
We have maybe time for one more question from the audience before we wrap up.
Yeah, I would have a question if that's allowed. You talked in some time ago about the question on how Putin might be, so to say, well, I wouldn't use the word overthrown, but replaced. And my question would be, for what signs do we need to look out if you want to know any future possible politician that is, so to say, able to make Putin that offer he can't refuse, to finally, so to say, well, let's just say, return to the spirit of the constitution prior to 2008, which is, so to say, 2 terms for a president and not necessarily more than that.
Well, I wouldn't make a big thing of the pre-2008 constitution, actually. I mean, I think the Rokirovka basically showed contempt for the constitution when he did that. But I think Putin doesn't like rivals. There are no, when people get too popular, they get moved on to other things. And so I think it's, but I mean, the one thing after 30 years, more than 30 years of studying Russia and the Soviet Union before it, the one thing I really am quite convinced of is it's making predictions is a mug's game. And you can make an analytical framework, which you can test against events, and that sometimes helps. But basically, almost everything we try and think we do and foresee in Russian politics is wrong. When we try and do things, we end up with the opposite result of what we wanted. And when we try and predict things, usually the wrong thing happens. So I think it's really important not to go down that road. And what we should do is to take a defensive posture, say what comes after Putin may well be worse. There's no reason to believe it'll be better. Maybe better, maybe worse. Let's focus on the stuff that we can control. So let's clean up our financial system so we're not vulnerable to Russian dirty money, and that we're not funding the worst people in Russia. And let's defend our allies and partners. Let's defend Ukraine, the Baltic states, the other countries around Russia, and concentrate on making them into safe, stable success stories. And that, I think, is the best chance of regaining our moral credibility, helping our friends inside Russia and giving them the best chance they can. But I just don't want to get into this guessing game of, oh gosh, Shoigu's appeared twice in the same week in standing next to Putin and slightly behind him. So that means he's probably going to be killed or maybe the next president. I just think that it doesn't work like that. Maybe we could do it in the 80s when I as a criminologist. But even then we usually got things wrong. So I suggest just not playing that game.
Thank you very much. That sounds like a good conclusive word, and seeing the time, we are going to have to end there. Thank you everybody for coming. Maybe just one last word about the upcoming conference in June. If you guys can show the slide there so we can have it in front of us. So our last conference of the year, so our year started in October, so say collected with the academic year, and it's going to end in June. And the last conference is going to be the geoeconomics of power transition, especially about how the power regimes in this post-Soviet space have influenced the economic development of this space. And of course, the logical speaker on that is Sergei Guriev, who kindly confirmed his participation, is a former chief economist of the EBRD.